Attention, dear friends, dear colleagues. Morning. How are you after a good party yesterday? Let's start our session on space physiology. First report: effect of space flight on human performance. Елена Томиловская, doctor from Institute Biomedical Problems, head of Department of Sensory, Motor and Countermeasures. Welcome, please, Елена.
Dear colleagues, good morning. Thank you very much for coming for this session. I hope our talk will be interesting for you. I am representative of the Institute of Biomedical Problems, and my department is work with the effects of spaceflight on sensory motor physiology, and we also develop countermeasurements to prevent negative effects of weightlessness. First of all, I want to show you the list of harmful factors of gravity unloading for human body system. It is not a secret that weightlessness is not very good for health, because our life is a constant fight with the gravity, and our organisms, they developing in gravity presence, and certainly when the gravity is absent, all the systems are reorganized during spaceflight. So what are the factors of spaceflight for sensory motor system? First of all, this is a sharp decline in mechanical loads, decline of axial and support loads, alterations of movements biomechanics, and deep alteration of sensory systems activity. All of these factors leads to many negative effects of spaceflight on human body system. First of all, this is a deconditioning, atrophy and structural changes in skeletal muscles. This is skeletal bone demineralization, cardiovascular deconditioning. Certainly, this is degradation of physical performance, loss of orthostatic tolerance, reduction of G-load tolerance, and many different alterations in coordination of movements in motor control. Here you can see the whole picture of hypergravitational motor syndrome. And you can see that we have changes and alterations in all the segments of sensory motor system, starting from the muscles and finishing with the motor control with high coordination of movements. If we see at the history of spaceflight, which was started from the very short spaceflight of Yuri Gagarin, it was 108 minutes, and then the duration of spaceflight started to increase. And here in 1970, we had a flight of 17 days, and that was actually, for that moment, that was the end of manned spaceflight, because 2 cosmonauts who participated in this flight returned to the Earth in a very bad state of health. And at that moment, the flights were finished because we understood that without any countermeasures, we cannot fly longer. And it took almost 2 years to develop the countermeasure system to prevent negative effects of weightlessness on human organism. And as you can see, this system was rather good, because we started to increase the duration of flights up to 438 days. That was a record for flight of Dr. Valery Polyakov. Sorry, I have two devices. Here is a short description of Russian countermeasure system currently available on ISS. First of all, certainly this is active physical training, like treadmill, walking and running. And treadmill walking and running can be performed in active regime and passive regime. That means active regime when the treadmill is moving by the motor, and passive regime when the treadmill is moving by the force of the legs of the cosmonaut. And in Russian system, we insist that cosmonauts should use both regimes. The other active physical training is bicycle ergometer, force training device, or resistive training, and axial loading suit penguin. This is passive mean, but you can do some resistive exercises in it, so it is like mixed measure. And we also have the list of passive countermeasure means. This means cannot be used instead of active physical training. But in some cases, when the cosmonaut is very busy or not very good state of health, this means can maintain for some level the physical performance of the cosmonauts. So first of all, this is axial loading suit penguin, the two types of electromyograph stimulators, which are directed to the training of muscle strength and muscle endurance, of postural and locomotor muscles, and also a compensator of support and loading. And we have a list of countermeasure means minimizing effects of fluid redistribution, which is also a big problem of space flight. This is pneumatic vacuum suit Chibis, low body negative pressure suit. This is anti-G suit, which they use usually during landing, occlusion cuffs, water salt supplements, and mechanical damping chair Kazbek, which is also used during landing. This is a scheme of 4 days training microcycle. In Russian countermeasure system, we divide all the flight on the blocks by 4 days, and each day has its own goal. For example, the first day is goal for maintenance of high velocity characteristics of muscles and orthostatic tolerance. The other days are goal for to train muscle endurance, for example, and so on. And 3 days are rather strict, and 4 day is actually cosmonaut can choose voluntary which protocol he will use for this 4th day. Certainly, we cannot tell to the cosmonaut that they must do something, and we can only recommend to train with this system. But usually, they follow these recommendations. A little bit in details, you can see the axial loading suit penguin, and the main sense of this is to provide axial loading on the body, on the muscles and bones, because in weightlessness we have no axial loading. We are like swimming in weightlessness, and we need to load the postural muscles, which are completely unloaded in space flight. The other passive mean is electromyograph stimulator. This is also the mean which cosmonauts can use during their operator activity. They can wear this suit doing what they need to do, and at the same time they have a muscle training. And this is rather new mean, which is not new for us, but for ISS board, this is rather new. This is mostly for acute stage of the flight. This is mechanical stimulator of the soul support zones. It provides the pressure to the zones of the souls which have the most density of pressure receptors. And this pressure goes in locomotor regimens like we are walking. This is heel toe one leg, heel toe the other leg. And we have several regimens of slow walking, of fast walking, give the information to the brain about the correct proprioceptive input. This is a picture, the list of testing. How can we assess the countermeasure efficacy while the cosmonaut is in flight, not after flight? First of all, we have a monitoring of physical exercises, and every day we have an information of the physical loading during flight. And we also have this locomotor test, which cosmonauts do at the end of each month of the flight. And also before EVA, we have a manual bicycling, because it is extremely important to have a nice strength of the hand muscles before EVA, because the most loading during EVA is for hands. And we also have some medical examinations. Basing on this information, we can make the conclusion on physical performance status of each of the cosmonauts. And here some results of this. We had several questions. For example, does the duration of flight influence physical performance if the cosmonauts do physical training very well? And here you can see the duration of flight and the rank of the health state of the cosmonauts from best to worst. And you can see that no any relation between health state and duration of flight. And at the same time, we have strong correlation of the health state with the volume of physical training. As I said, we have a really nice countermeasure system which allow us to maintain physical performance of the cosmonauts in the flights of 1 year and even more. However, the countermeasure has some disadvantages. First of all, it takes a lot of time. Usually it takes more than 2 hours per day, and this can be a problem. This is quite rigid and not absolutely safe, especially when we are talking about resistive exercises. There is some risks to get traumas, muscle traumas. It can be monotonous, especially for running. It is not supplied by effective and easy use system of monitoring of cosmonauts' fitness and countermeasure efficacy, and it is always controlled by on-ground specialists, and so we give our recommendation regularly. You should train harder, or maybe you can have a rest, and so on. And actually, it doesn't provide fitness level that's sufficient for independent activity of cosmonauts during first hours and days after landing. And further, I will show you what I am talking about in this last sentence. I will show you some results of field test experiment, which we have together. This is a joint experiment with NASA. And we have already examined 23 cosmonauts and 27 astronauts. We started it in 2013. the main goal of this experiment was to assess functional performance of the cosmonauts in the very first hours after landing, and also to look at the dynamic of recovery of this performance. So we have experiments immediately after landing in the medical tent on the landing site, and then we have some testings several hours after and several days after, up to 11 days after the flight. And here are the results. The test consists of rather simple battery of tests: to stand from the sitting position, to stand from the prone position, to walk a little bit, to walk with some difficulties with overstepping the obstacles, and so on. And you can see that approximately 20% of crew didn't even attempt to start the test at the landing site. That means that they were in really bad state. Approximately 40% started the battery of tests but didn't finish it. And only 40% really succeed to do all the battery. I cannot say that they did it excellent, but they managed to finish all the program. Here you can see during the test implementation from one test to the other test, we asked the cosmonauts about their feeling on motion sickness. How do they feel? And that was the scale of 20. 20, I cannot do anything. I can just lie and not to open eyes. And 0 is absolutely excellent. And you see the results of our cosmonauts on the landing site. So this is approximately 20 or 30 minutes after landing. And you can see that their motion sickness evaluation was around 10. It is really bad because before flight it is always 0, and maybe on the second day after flight it is not more than 2. So all of the cosmonauts, they have this motion sickness. And you can see that 3 cosmonauts finished the test just at the beginning, then 4 cosmonauts, then 2 cosmonauts. So during the test, actually, some of the cosmonauts start to feel much worse and just quit the test. This is the example. This is the example recovery from fall test, when the cosmonaut is lying in prone position for 2 minutes, and then he should stand up and stand for 3 minutes. This is a rather simple task for everyone, but not for the cosmonauts. You can see we have special measuring soles, and they can record the perturbation of the center of pressure. And you can see how it should look when you are standing for 3 minutes before flight in normal conditions. So just a very small spot. And on the landing site, you can see how much, how big perturbation is starting with the body. And here you can also see the same in graphs. So this is a body perturbation in frontal plane, so from left to right. Yes, it's before flight, and after flight on the day of landing, you can see that it can reach even 1,000% changes. And also on 12th day after flight, you can see that the situation is not normalized. The other test is chest pushes, when somebody is chesting you, is pushing you to the chest. Your body goes backward and forward, and then you are stable. And you are moving only in one direction, in the direction of the push. This is the picture before flight, and this is a picture on the landing site. So you see that the body's perturbation goes to the different direction and very high amplitude. And actually, not very good situation we see even 12 days after landing. This is our favorite test, tandem walk. This is a heel-to-toe walk, and this is also not very complicated. You can train 2 times and you will do it excellent. And here, when you do the tandem walking, you have the picture of trajectory of center of pressure, like 8 or very strong shape. And here you can see the picture on the landing site. And even 3 days, 8 days, and 10 days, it is not completely back to the pre-flight values. And if we will count the correct steps, correct heel-to-toe steps before flight, it will be around 12 because the way is around 12. And on the landing site, it is trying to be 0. Actually, I didn't see the cosmonaut who could manage all the steps on the landing site. And you can see the progressive recovery of this parameter up to 11 days after flight. And here you can see how it goes on the landing site. So a lot of people should catch the cosmonaut. He's trying to do heel-to-toe walk. Yes, but he cannot. And this is the 3rd day after flight. It is better, but still not very good. And this is 12 days after flight. You can also see that he still has some difficulties with this test. Certainly, this is evident that when we will fly to the moon, they will not need to do heel-to-toe test. But anyway, they will need to do some complicated locomotions, and by this test we can show that it is not possible during the first hours and maybe even days after flight. For investigations, we cannot use only space flight because we have too few cosmonauts and the space flights are too long. So to have 10 cosmonauts, we need to wait for several years, and this is not very good for the science. That's why we usually use ground-based models of microgravity. I'm sure you know that the most common model of microgravity is a parabolic flight. And certainly it really reproduces weightlessness, but only for 23 seconds. That means that we can study only very acute reaction of organism to weightlessness. And we cannot study any chronic adaptations. That's why all over the world, mostly it is used head down till bed rest, which is also usually rather long to get nice effects of gravity unloading. And we usually use dry immersion model. This is a picture of this model. This is a bath filled with warm water, and covered with a rubber foam with a big area, such as the subject is immersed in the water and not contacting to the water. That's why we can use this model of any duration. And couple of words about current studies. Last year we started the long-term dry immersion. It was 21-day dry immersion. Actually, the longest experiment was 56 days, but it was in 1970s, and not so many studies were provided in that experiment. And after that, for more than 40 years, we worked only with 5 or 7 days dry immersion because it reproduced very well all the effects of short-term space flight. But to get some changes, for example, in bone system, it is necessary to have longer duration. That's why we started this 21 days dry immersion, and we took as an example the guidelessness for bed rest studies, and we also included the studies of almost all the system of organism. And we had 10 healthy volunteers in 21-day dry immersion, and at the end of this month we are starting the new session that will be 21-day dry immersion coupled with artificial gravity with short arm centrifuge usage. And in this way we can understand if artificial gravity will be effective in preventing all these changes we get after 3 weeks dry immersion. We have a rather big collaboration, mostly Russian, but we have some collaborators in this experiment with Romania, with Sweden, and with Germany. And we always open for cooperation, so if you will be interested, you're welcome. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Tomilovskaya, thank you very much. This report is very interesting for everybody, I think. Next step of our discussion today, report human physiology affected by space flight. Our colleague and friend Mark Shell-Hammond from without. Of course, I know. Johns Hopkins Center, Baltimore, United States of America. Thank you very much. Welcome, please.
Thank you, Dr. Belikovsky. Good morning. So I am back in my academic position at Johns Hopkins University. But for 3 years, I served as the chief scientist for the Human Research Program for NASA at Johnson Space Center. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, despite the fact that you see the HRP logo in the upper left-hand corner, that's because I can't figure out how to get that off of my PowerPoint slides. I no longer speak officially for NASA, although I will be talking about the physiological changes that take place in space from NASA's particular point of view, at least at the start of my talk, because they take a very particular perspective on how to approach these problems, which I think, although it has some shortcomings, is instructive and does have some benefits to it. What else did I want to say? Okay, so I was asked nominally to talk about physiological aspects of people in space flight. And you've heard a lot about many of the physiological aspects already. In the artificial gravity session, Dr. Young, Dr. Van Loon talked about many of them. You just heard a wonderful talk that outlines some of the same things that I'm going to touch upon. So I'm going to go over the kind of the common things that you've seen many times already rather quickly, and I'm going to concentrate on some of the things that maybe are not so obvious. For example, psychological effects on physiological changes in space. Assuming I can make this happen. Oh, the other. Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so if you're going to talk about the myriad changes that take place to the body when you send people in space, it's helpful to have some kind of logical categorization or a way to get a handle on things so you can start to approach this in a systematic way. So one of the ways that I'm going to say we as if I'm still working at NASA, one of the ways this particular community looks at these is by organizing the risks to human health and performance in long-duration spaceflight by the particular hazards of spaceflight. And you can see the hazards laid out there. Artificial gravity, weightlessness nominally, radiation, distance from Earth, isolation and confinement, two different things. Isolation and confinement is the spacecraft being small number of people, small space. Distance from Earth has to do much more so with crew autonomy and the need to address especially medical problems that are urgent in a completely autonomous fashion, separate from ground control due to time delays, and a hostile enclosed environment, by which we mean toxicology, elevated CO2 levels, those types of things. Obviously, by far the one with the largest number of risks as currently defined and tracked by NASA is the altered gravity situation. I'm going to talk about some of those here. I'm not going to talk about gravity, partly because I don't understand the gravity effects that much. It's a complicated problem, partly because there's a radiation session later on, and partly because the radiation issue, it remains contentious, and NASA is revamping its approach to radiation even now. So after saying I'm not going to say anything about it, I'll say one additional thing about it. There are a couple of different ways of looking at the radiation problem. The way NASA looks at it right now separates them between acute effects and chronic effects. Chronic effects could be an increased lifetime prevalence of cancer after spending time in space. So in America, we like to think if the National Institutes of Health has not solved the problem of cancer, NASA is not going to cure cancer, so that you could argue that that's not really in their purview. It's in-mission risks that NASA is really focusing on. So if there's a solar flare, a solar particle event, an acute exposure to a high radiation dose that causes an immediate decline in cognitive function, that's the kind of thing that gets their attention. But that's poorly characterized. So stay tuned for more on, not for me, but more information on radiation soon. Okay. So this is the way that NASA approaches all of those different risks that you just saw. This is the chart that everybody loves to hate at NASA. This is the one that my predecessor and successor, John Charles, would say that when you present this, you want to put this up, you want to take it down before anybody has a chance to read it. Because if anybody really pays attention to it in detail, you can pick it apart. That's not the point. The point is to look at the big picture of this and recognize that some risks are more important than others, carry a higher priority than others. So the way this is done is a standard approach to what's called continuous risk management. There's a column over there, the second one from the left, labeled L by C, likelihood and consequence. If something has a high likelihood of occurring, going bad, that's more than 1% would be high likelihood in NASA's parlance, and the consequences are bad, debilitation or possibly death or long-term morbidity, that gets a red rating. And there's a chart that helps people figure all this out. It's done very rigorously. If something is inherently or through countermeasures, low likelihood, low consequence, it gets a green rating, and something in the middle is obviously yellow. So the job of the Human Research Program is to take red things, make them yellow things, make them green. There are couple of blue bars way out here, at least one, which means you're in the optimization stage. You're making the countermeasure better, cheaper, faster, lighter, whatever it is. You can see that there are the thing that makes people nervous. There's this vast area down there on the lower right-hand corner which things just disappear. Well, this is NASA's way of saying that at some point, given the fact that there are red risks at the top, we're going to have to stop doing research on some of the lower priority risks. Well, that's, as you can imagine, very contentious. That doesn't mean they are solved, but they are means relative to what's on top. And let me say what's on top. The risks are listed down the far left-hand column. There's about 30 of them. The top 3 on here, I believe, are related to radiation. Like I said, that's currently under discussion and debate. The next one is what NASA euphemistically calls behavioral medicine. That's psychology, psychiatry, mood, motivation, all the effects of small groups of people, small space, long periods of time. And then it goes down from there. Okay, so here's the problem. You just heard this described in the previous talk. Astronauts, cosmonauts, these are tough people. These are not people who are used to getting a lot of help doing anything, and yet when they land, nominally after 6 months on the space station, in most cases they have to literally be lifted out of the Soyuz spacecraft, immediately put in seats for their press event, and then carried over to the medical tent where they do the field test and some other initial medical evaluations. As far as we know, we're not going to have this kind of assistance when we send people to the moon or Mars. At least not on the first flight. Okay. So I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly because you've heard these before. Bone density, everyone always asks about the bone problem. That seems to be one that a lot of people are aware of, and it is true. Without countermeasures, astronauts, cosmonauts can lose about up to 1% of bone mineral density per month in space. NASA has some countermeasures here that it's very happy with. So you can see in any given area, so let's pick the grouping of bars all the way on the left-hand side. You can see that there's some blue symbols that indicate the experience in Mir, red that indicate the International Space Station Interim Resistive Exercise Device, IRED. The next set of symbols, the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. I'll show a picture of that. And finally, the green symbols, bisphosphonates, osteoporosis medication, plus the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And which, with every improvement, every incremental improvement in the countermeasure, the amount of loss of bone mineral density decreases until you're at the point where some of those green symbols are above the 0 line. Some people are coming back with improved bone mineral density than when they left, because not all astronauts, believe it or not, exercise for 1 or 2 hours a day before they fly on the ground, whereas that's what they do when they get into space. And presumably they're not all taking bisphosphonates either. Okay, so this is pretty good. It's not perfect. There are still some indications that there is lack of a recovery back to baseline, but this is one of the things that compels NASA to look at this and say, well, relative to radiation, relative to psychology, relative to some of the other issues, this maybe isn't so pressing anymore. Now, the big caveat in this is bone mineral density. This is not bone strength necessarily. We don't have a good way to connect bone mineral density to bone strength in the particular population that we're dealing with here. There's a lot of information on bone strength and osteoporosis, bone strength in the elderly, changes in bone mineral density, but in relatively young, healthy populations, very vigorous, who exercise a lot and eat well, we really don't have that connection. We don't have the epidemiology to do the connection. A good way to get a really good measure of the trabecular bone, the bone structure inside the bone, which relates more directly to bone strength, is peripheral QCT, quantitative computed tomography, and that entails a radiation hit, so it's not ubiquitously used. Okay, similar thing for muscle function. This is ARED. You see it on the ground on the right-hand side, in space on the left-hand side. As you can see, very effective for many things: bone, muscle, cardiovascular function, aerobic capacity. But it's kind of big and it's kind of heavy. So this has to be downsized significantly if exercise is going to be used as a countermeasure, at least for Mars planning on the way there, on the way back. Okay, sensory motor, I'm not going to belabor this because Dr. Tomlevskaya did a great job talking about this. She even presented what I was going to present, but she really did the video. NASA likes to de-identify their subjects, so they turn the videos into stick figures. But what you were going to see here was what you just saw a few minutes ago. When they come back on day 0, they are a mess. They are ataxic. And it's not a muscle problem, because they're exercising significantly. It's a coordination problem. It's a problem having to do with the fact that the brain has learned that there's the absence of a net gravito-inertial force vector, 0g, and learns to ignore the missing information, learns that it's not to be relied upon. Okay, if they pull it up. Okay, so that's after a short duration mission. They're asked to walk along that line, and that's pretty good. And this is after 6 months in ISS, the day of return. And remember, these are healthy individuals. These are people who are athletic. They're coordinated. They work out. They're used to moving around. And this is a real mess. Now, this is a concern for a lot of reasons, right? First of all, it tells you something is going on with sensory motor systems in general. It's an operational concern because if you land somewhere and you have to evacuate the spacecraft in an emergency, you're not going anywhere, especially if you put a spacesuit on before you get out of the spacecraft. NASA's very concerned about this right now because of an immediate concern, which is the new Orion capsule that NASA's developing is going to land in the water. So they won't have to get out and walk, but they will have to get out. And if they have to get out unaided, if the Navy is not right there immediately to help them, some of them may not be able to make it out. So that's why it's a real concern. I'll tell you, I should follow up on that a little bit. It's not so much of a concern because of the motion sickness aspect per se. Right? That was a huge concern back in the shuttle days. Motion sickness in space is what got me through graduate school because it was a huge operational concern for shorter missions. Now, if you're sending people into space for months at a time, a couple of days of motion sickness here and there, not such a big deal. Still not pleasant. Okay, going to skip that. Okay. So this is one you've heard some allusion to on and off. There's some contention about the causes. But this is one that has NASA's attention in a big way at the moment. The so-called visual impairment intracranial pressure problem, that's the old name. When people finally, it's abbreviated VIP, V-I-I-P. When people finally memorized what VIP stood for, NASA decided they had to change the name. So now it's called SANS, Spaceflight Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, SANS. Same idea, except the new name does broaden the scope. This name had the unfortunate feature of making it sound like it was a done deal. We know it's intracranial pressure. We're not sure, but it's very likely. So here's the problem. We've known ever since we've been sending people into space that there is a headward shift of fluids, cerebrospinal fluid, blood, lymph fluid, all sorts of fluids. See a perfect example over there, Story Musgrave, famous astronaut, on the ground and in space, puffy face, stuffy sinuses, well known. Taste sensation decreases because of this. One of the consequences of this fluid shift would presumably be, due to shift of cerebrospinal fluid around the brain and spinal cord, an increase in intracranial pressure, an increase in the pressure of the fluid surrounding the head. Well, there's one outlet, there's one relief valve for the cerebrospinal fluid, and that's unfortunately to make its way down the sheath of the optic nerve. So the fluid, as the theory goes, works its way down the sheath of the optic nerve to the back of the eyeball, pushes on the back of the eyeball, changes its shape. That's what causes the change in visual acuity, which gives it the name visual impairment. And you can see an example down there at the bottom, globe flattening. Those are MRI images of the globe, the eyeball. And you can see before flight, nice and round. On the right-hand side, after flight, squashed. And there are a number of other things that lead to believe that it's an intracranial pressure problem. But, like I said, it's not conclusive, and there's significant evidence also to indicate that exercise, poorly performed, increase in abdominal pressure, Valsalva maneuver, increases pressure in the head, in the cranial cavity. Elevated CO2 level. CO2 level is significantly elevated on the space station because it's expensive in terms of resources, in terms of energy, to scrub it down lower. So it's typically about 10 to 20 times what it is ambiently on the Earth. CO2 levels known to have an effect on some of these things. So this is a work in progress, and this is really a serious one because not necessarily the visual problem per se. I mean, no one's thrilled when you screw around with vision in astronauts. That worries people. But it's the fact that this could be just the beginnings of an indication of more extensive neural damage due to slightly but chronically elevated intracranial changes and increases in intracranial pressure. So are we going to see a bigger problem as we extend the flights? Which leads me to a point that I want to make completely separate from this. We didn't start seeing this particular problem in visual impairment until astronauts, cosmonauts, were spending 6 months on the space station. Now, retrospectively, some people went back and started looking at some of the longer 2-week or so shuttle missions, and maybe you can see some indications of an increase in visual impairment, a change in visual acuity. But it was easy to write them off because you were sending people into space that were in early middle age. And so you would expect if they were up there, maybe they would have a vision change. It's not a great solution, so there was some wishful thinking there. But it raises the question, if you didn't see this until you were doing 6-month missions, what are we going to see when we go to 1-year missions? What are we going to see when we go to 3-year missions, to 5-year missions, to however long you want to make them? It's the fact that this wasn't predicted widely is something that is really kind of scary because it means that there's a lack of a conceptual foundation for understanding what's going on when you send people into space, by which you can make predictions of what's going to happen on different time courses. Everything that comes up like this seems to take us by surprise, and that's really not good. We should have some kind of more systematic way of looking at this. All right, that's my soapbox. Okay, let me touch on psychological issues for a while, what NASA calls behavioral health. Behavioral areas susceptible to risk, you can see many of them there, changes in cardiac function, mood, morale, cognitive function, interpersonal conflicts, potentially, a number of other things. Now this, I hesitate to bring this up whenever there's an astronaut in the audience. I don't know if there are any of our astronaut colleagues here, because astronauts will, in many cases, object to this and say that, well, yeah, of course, it's stressful. That's what we do. We eat stress for breakfast. We rise to the occasion. It needs to be stressful because that brings out the best in us. Okay, maybe, but they're still human. So let's say that they do work through the psychological stress, the psychological issues. That doesn't mean that there are not physiological consequences of those psychological stressors. So well-known effects of psychological stress on cardiovascular function, immune system function, so now it becomes a physiological issue. In addition to the fact that there are going to be psychological issues, even with some wishful thinking. So one of my favorite experiments from the Human Research Program, I like it because it's beautiful in its simplicity, and you can go to the NASA website and download the final report for this project. Jack Stuster was the principal investigator. It's called the Journals Project. Just want to give a couple of results from this. It's exactly what it sounds like. Those astronauts who agreed to be subjects for this filled out a journal on a certain schedule, whatever that schedule was, and they could write in this on the computer anything that they wanted, anything that was on their minds, downloaded to a very secure server where the PI would go through and extract keywords and phrases that corresponded to various psychological or operational issues, and then would look at them systematically. And you can see a couple of troubling things, at least from the parameters that I've selected here. They don't all show this same trend, but there are at least a couple. So journal entries on the left on conflict by mission quarters. So over a 6-month mission, divide that into quarters, track the number of entries in the journals across a number of people. And the trend initially goes down a little bit, but then starts to go up. On the right-hand side, group interaction positivity. You take the good things people are saying. Oh, it's great, a lot of teamwork, we're getting along, we're doing a great job here, glad to be here. You subtract the bad things. I can't stand my partner, he chews with his mouth open, whatever it is. You subtract those, you get net positivity. That's going down monotonically over the course of a 6-month mission. Is this significant statistically? Is it going to continue when you go to 1 year, 3 years? We don't know, but here's one reason it's troubling. These data do not exhibit what's known as the third quarter effect. The third quarter effect is being in your third year in college, right? The first 2 years, kind of exciting, doing new things, learning about new people and places. The last year, senior, you're almost on your way out, the end is in sight. That third year, you're just slogging it out. It's no longer new. You just want to get out of there, but getting out of there is so far away. Turns out the third quarter effect is ubiquitous. It happens in a huge number of different things, no matter the length, no matter the duration of the thing. We've already presumably passed the third quarter effect in my talk about 5 minutes ago, when you wish I would just finish and get on with it. So now, hopefully, you see that the end is in sight, and now we're in the fourth quarter. Antarctic winter overs, third quarter effect. We don't see the third quarter effect here. Is that good or bad? We don't know, but it means we don't understand the time course, and that's why it's of concern. So another little example, this I owe to Dave Dinges, who was nice enough to show me this a few years ago. Dave Dinges, an investigator at University of Pennsylvania in human health and behavioral performance. This was visual analog scale of stress ratings, scale of 0 to 100. The astronaut subjects who agreed to do this would just put a dot down. On a scale of 0 to 100, how stressed do you feel right now? Whatever you mean by stress, normalized to whatever baseline you want. I mean, it was a very rough cut at this, and I don't know how many people participated, but you can see that the black line goes out to 180 days, 6-month mission. That is not a promising trend, right? Whatever they mean by stress, it's not getting better. Now, Dave, being a good researcher who wants to get more support for this, was helpful enough to fit a cubic polynomial to this. And you can see that if you extend this out to a 1-year mission, people's heads are going to explode. They're just not going to make it. Now, we don't know if that's the case. It may plateau. But again, it's not a promising trend. Okay, I'm going to skip that. All right, let me say this. Space is nasty for humans in general. Many things can go wrong. Medical events, physiological events, psychological. A lot is expected from astronauts. They have to work at peak performance in a challenging environment. And especially on Mars missions or more extensive missions, they're going to be largely on its own. Now, in the last few minutes, let me tell you what I think is the real essential element of all of this stuff, because we can put together, as NASA has done, that's not just NASA, a good plan for addressing the individual risks, the individual issues. So you can see most systems are affected. I've listed some of them. You've heard about a lot of them. They happen over different time courses and magnitudes. There are consequences for health and performance. That's when you really get concerned. If there's a health effect, you could say, okay, fine, we'll deal with it when you come back. But if it affects your performance during the mission, that's when it becomes an operational problem. Now, here's the point that I want to get at. The responses are commonly explored individually. The colored chart that I showed you earlier, the NASA chart, the so-called integrated path to risk reduction, sometimes we call those, a little bit derogatorily, swim lanes, right? They just track each risk across the timeline. Stovepipes, silos, lots of names for this. This is not unique to NASA, that each of those disciplines is addressed largely independently of the others. This is a ubiquitous problem in biomedical research. But these systems interact in ways that we don't understand. So I'm not the first person to think of this. This is a quote, I'll attribute it to Ron White, but it's from White and Avener. Meeting the health-related challenges of space exploration requires we abandon a model of the body that has muscles, bones, heart, and brains acting independently. Body parts will not travel on exploration missions. The individual traveler's body must be viewed realistically with all parts connected and fully interacting. We're really bad at doing that. How would you even do that? Well, one of the things you might want to do is start with the categorization. So I was able to draw this from a larger version. This is a chart that I did not put this together, but people love to hate this chart, just like the other one. This was put together by Jennifer Mindock, who I had the pleasure of working with at NASA. She's still there in the Human Research Program, just part of her doctoral work at the University of Colorado Boulder. A few years ago, she calls it a contributing factor map. the factors that contribute to human health and performance in a long-duration spaceflight. This is the entire map. Down there below, just below center, is the domain of human health and performance. This. Physiological issues, psychological issues, cognitive issues, behavioral issues. Okay, you can categorize them. Now, even so, you've got all these boxes. This just still represents the problem because it's a categorization. These are connected to each other, but they're explored independently. When you look at it in the context of a larger spaceflight, the problem gets even worse because the way you design the spacecraft, the way you design the mission, the way you design the training, the way the crew is interacting with mission control, the support that they do or do not have from their peers, colleagues, and families on the ground, those are all boxes in here. Those all affect health and performance in space, but they're generally not treated in a synergistic way. There's a pretense to saying, we're going to just keep the person healthy and we'll plug that person into a mission and we'll be fine. All of these things interact. And not only that, the ability of the crew to perform mission tasks then feeds back. So the integrity of the mission depends on the health and performance of the crew, which depends on the integrity of the mission. So very quickly, it's something that could get out of hand. I'm going to stop there, even though I could go on and on with more detail, but I'm just going to make a plea for the fact that what we really need here, in addition to the disciplinary expertise in all of the individual areas that many of us have talked about this week, what we really need is a systematic scientific approach to understanding the interactions not only between the physiological areas, but between the physiology, the psychology, and the larger mission plan. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Mark Schellhammer, thank you very much for your very, very interesting lecture. Dear colleagues and friends, next speaker of our session, Stephen Jillings from University of Antwerp, Belgium, with a report the effect of space on the human brain. But small information for everybody. After this report, we want to show you small, about 6 minutes film about sport on ISS. For my opinion, very interesting film. Welcome.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here to present our work about the effects of spaceflight on the human brain. Despite it might seem actually a very common thing to investigate in the context of spaceflight, it has actually been largely unexplored for many years, and also in this conference, the brain has not come to be addressed very much yet. So this is why we, almost 10 years ago, the Brain ETI project was set up. And so in this project, we aim to investigate the effects of spaceflight on the brain. And we do this by acquiring MRI data of cosmonauts before their spaceflight mission, typically lasting 6 months, acquiring MRI data as soon as possible after their mission, and then again 7 months after as follow-up data. We additionally acquired MRI scans of a control population at 2 time points, which actually match the pre- and post-flight data of the cosmonauts. And I will not really talk about these data in particular, but I can tell you now that most effects or the most results that I will show later on also have been tested for potential aging effects through these control scans, and we can conclude that all the results are attributed to spaceflight effects. So whenever we acquire an MRI scan of a cosmonaut, we actually acquire different modalities, different types. At the left side here, I don't know, is the pointer working? So the left two here, the T1 weighted and the diffusion MRI, are both structural MRI scans. And from there, we can look at the gray matter, white matter, and CSF. For the T1, we can look at them separately, but the diffusion MRI actually has the additional advantage that within one area, we can actually look at the fraction of each of the 3 different tissue types, while for the T1, one area is either attributed to CSF or white matter or gray matter. So for the diffusion MRI, we can actually look at the densities, which then reflect these fractions of each tissue type within the area. We can also look at volume differences between MRI scans, and when we then multiply these volume estimates with the density estimates, we obtain mass, as the classical formula, density times volume equals mass. So this actually gives an indication of the net amount of brain tissue rather than the relative densities. And here on the right side is another modality, functional MRI. So in the video, you see a finger tapping task, which activates the motor cortex in the brain. And also all the different red areas there, they are all functionally connected because they respond to the same task. So we also looked at functional connectivity changes, but for this presentation, it's not about the finger tapping task, but it's actually functional connectivity between the different brain areas during rest, and because this gives an indication of the overall functional brain architecture. So our results, these are the results of the T1 images, so where we look at the gray matter and CSF separately. And we see that for the CSF, here at the top, there is a decrease of the CSF volume, and there's an increase here at the inferior side. And so this is very clearly, you can really draw a line here with decreases above it and increases below it. So this really points to a redistribution of the CSF in response to long-duration spaceflight. For gray matter volume, we see also large-scale gray matter volume decreases, and which actually correspond largely with the CSF increases we see here in the temporal lobe. And at first, these results are a bit puzzling. We don't really know what the underlying cause is or what, how we can exactly explain it. But when we look at the follow-up data, so 6 or 7 months after spaceflight, we see that there is already some normalization here, but only partially. And so this already gives a first indication that these results that we see here after spaceflights are actually reversible, which is already a good sign. On the other hand, when we look at the CSF 7 months after spaceflight, you see here a global increase, which I will explain later where that comes from. Then another particularly interesting result is actually here, the brain ventricles, which we found to be enlarged in volume. This actually also has been published in other journals, but we additionally wanted to quantify this more accurately. And when we did that, we saw that there is actually a more than 10% increase in the ventricular volume of the lateral ventricles and third ventricles. While this is not the case for the fourth ventricle, it was not significantly altered. And also at follow-ups, 7 months after spaceflight, it remained increased, but with respect to the post-flight values, there is already a decrease. So again, there is this kind of partial normalization and an ongoing normalization process. Then when we look at the diffusion MRI results, so first of all, when we look at the CSF, again, this gives the same image of the CSF redistribution with less CSF at the top, more at the bottom. And we also see when we look at the volume, the overall volume changes, that this very much reflects this CSF redistribution. And the interesting thing here is when we look at the gray matter density, we see that it increases in these same areas as where the CSF decreases. And so we can actually attribute this to the fact that if we see that there is less volume in these regions, then if you have the same amount of matter in a smaller volume, the density will actually increase. So from there, Also, when we formally test the differences in mass, we don't see any differences here. So we can actually conclude that there's no actual change in the overall amount of the gray matter mass, neither increase or decrease here. So these seem to be more morphological changes, and this probably also extends to the T1 analysis that I showed in the previous slide. So when we then look at the follow-up data for the diffusion MRI, so here at first show again the pre to post-flight differences for CSF gray matter and volume. And when we then look at the difference between post-flight and follow-up, we actually see almost the mirrored image of the top row. So this actually highlights the reversal of the effects of space flights, which is a good sign. Only here, when we test the difference between the pre-flight data and the follow-up data, we see this remaining increase in volume around the ventricles, which also corresponds with our earlier findings. So to actually give an overview of all these fluid shift effects, so what seems to be happening is because of this microgravity-induced upward fluid shift, there is probably a hampered CSF resorption, which can be due to increased central venous pressure and other factors as well. And this can actually cause a slow or slight accumulation of intracranial fluid. And we see this by, for example, the ventricular expansion, which in our belief is actually a coping mechanism to store this extra accumulated CSF or accumulated fluid. And also here at the inferior sides of the brain, the fact that we see increases in CSF there also probably means that this is a site where the accumulated CSF can actually reside. And eventually this can cause an uplifting of the brain, which has also been previously noted by other research groups. And this whole change in the CSF dynamics caused these gray matter density morphological changes. At follow-up then, so 7 months afterwards, we see that this accumulated CSF gets released. So this would actually cause this global CSF expansion that we see here. And this also could explain why the ventricular volume still remains a little expanded, but it's very slowly actually going towards its pre-flight levels. So we can actually conclude that there is a very slow normalization progress going on because we can still see these effects 7 months after space flights. Then for a whole different mechanism now, also with the diffusion MRI, we saw here in the white matter of the cerebellum and here in the gray matter of the basal ganglia, that's the net amount of tissue, so the tissue mass had increased. And both cerebellum and basal ganglia are very important structures in sensory motor function. And so this actually very much supports that these are caused by neuroplasticity mechanisms. And also, very briefly, I want to show with these box plots, when we look at, so here for the cerebellum, this is the white matter increase that we saw on the image in the previous slide. When we look at the CSF, these are actually these little black lines that you just do not see, which means that the amount of CSF in these areas is actually negligible. And so this also further supports that this is not caused by fluid shift effects, but is probably or most likely the neuroplasticity mechanisms. Also very shortly about our functional MRI data. These are preliminary results where we look at a key region in the brain involved in vestibular processing. And we see that after space flights, the vestibular cortex exerts less connectivity with these two areas here in the brain. Particularly interesting is here the right angular gyrus, which is also known to integrate different sensory modalities and even has a specific function in the perception of upper right. For the follow-up, which is the third, the yellow plot here, we also see that there is actually only an intermediate step of normalization, but so this has to be further examined as these are still preliminary results. But we do see that the vestibular system at the cortical level actually exerts also adaptations. So an overview for the neuroplasticity is that we see motor learning, as we saw for the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. So this is probably a neural correlate for the motor strategies that had to be adapted for when moving around in space. And also the vestibular system seems to be adapted at the cortical level due to the deprivation of vestibular stimuli in space. So when we briefly look at the countermeasures, so the countermeasures would rather be targeted to the fluid shift effects. So this could be lower body negative pressure, artificial gravity, even maybe acetazolamide is a blocker of the CSF production, which might also, so all these three mechanisms could actually prevent the accumulation of the CSF or the fluid inside the skull. And but for the neuroplasticity results that we saw, we actually don't want countermeasures because this is most likely a beneficial way of the brain to adapt to the space environment. So what we want to do there is actually maybe pinpoint more these areas and look more accurately in them to see if they can maybe predict performance in space or also readaptation when they come back, and maybe see what effects it has also for astronauts going on consecutive missions. So to conclude, the upward fluid shift, which is a known phenomenon in microgravity, affects the CSF circulation, and it is still disturbed 7 months after spaceflight, but it seems that there is a normalization progress ongoing. Also, the brain ventricles are expanded and show a partial normalization 7 months after. The gray matter tissue undergoes morphological changes rather than actual tissue loss or changes in the net amount of tissue. And then in basal ganglia and cerebellum, so in sensory motor areas, and also in the vestibular system, we seem to find signs of neuroplasticity as an adaptation strategy to space. So that was it. Thank you for your attention.
Steven, thank you very much. High class, good job, and good luck for you. Please, video about friends. Yes.
И одним движением поднимают махом сразу две руки. И репортеры налетели, и киногамер словно мух. В здоровом теле, здоровом теле, здоровом теле, здоровый дух. Качаем железо, чтоб были стальными и мышцы, и нервы, и жилы, и взгляд. Но скажем вам честно, словами простыми, нет в мире душевней железных ребят.
кручу, кручу, педали кручу. С горы, с горы, с горы, как птица лечу. Спешу, 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 спешу налегке навстречу радуге дуге. Пусть, пусть дорога вдали бежит, грусть пусть на сердце не лежит. Мне все на свете по плечу, и с песни этой качу по свету, качу, качу, куда хочу. Терпи, 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 когда тяжело. Скрипи, скрипи, ты подо мною седло. Не смей, не смей, не смей на миг ослабеть. Сумей себя преодолеть. Пусть, пусть дорога вдаль бежит, грусть пусть на сердце не лежит. Мне все на свете по плечу, и с песни этой качу по свету, качу, качу, куда хочу.
Будет небесам жарко, сложат о героях песни. В спорте надо жить ярко, надо побеждать честно. Замерли вокруг люди, светятся экраны телек. Верьте, что рекорд будет, знайте, мы близки к цели. Мы верим твердо в героев спорта, нам победа как воздух нужна. Мы хотим всем рекордам наши звонкие дать имена. Мы хотим всем рекордам наши звонкие дать имена.
Steven. Attention, attention, okay. We start our round table. My first question to Elena. Раньше было так, космонавтики, если люди летали в дальний космос, задача была долететь, поставить флаг, сфотографироваться, улететь.
You know, in old days, what was the mission of a space flight? You had to fly as far as you could, put a flag on, and then go back.
Сейчас другие задачи. Надо приехать, заниматься освоением, может быть, колонизацией. Что будет делать космонавт на дальней планете? Он вышел, сможет ли он работать?
However, now the objectives are quite different. You need to fly there, you need maybe to settle, you need maybe to colonize a planet, a remote planet. So what is there in store for a cosmonaut? Will he be able to survive and work there?
As you saw from my presentation and from Mark's presentation, certainly cosmonauts has special difficulties with motor control and orthostatic tolerance after flight. So some of the tasks are possible to do immediately after flight, but not so much. To do some complicated operator activity, they will need some time, maybe hours, maybe days for some tasks, maybe even weeks to do it very well. So we need to think about planning of the operator activity, about the plan of operator activity for the astronauts and cosmonauts on the other planets.
А может быть, есть смысл не посылать человека, а посылать роботов. И мне кажется, может быть, и дешевле, и надежнее, потому что человек – это самое уязвимое звено в космонавтике. И самое главное, чтобы сохранить его безопасность, чтобы он не погиб. Может быть, закроем пилотируемую космонавтику и будем надеяться на роботов.
But maybe it makes more sense not to send humans into space, but to send robots, because they're cheaper, they're more reliable, and as we know, humans are the weakest link in the space exploration. So maybe it makes no sense to continue those programs, and maybe we need to start thinking about robots.
Can I answer the previous question instead? No,
Так я специально для нашего американского друга каверзный вопрос подготовил.
I prepared this one specially for you. This is a tricky one for you.
Okay, so I said something about this yesterday at the press conference, which is, and I'll start with this answer, which I'm not sure can be improved upon. There was a report that came out a few years ago from a group at MIT that explored this issue of why send people into space when automated missions can do many things as well or better. And the bottom line they came up with was that putting people into space expands the human experience. And that's about as basic as it gets. You either kind of buy into that and believe that's a valuable thing to do. Apart from that, you can make all sorts of other arguments that by definition, we're going into an unexpected domain. So it's unrealistic to expect that you can program even the most resilient and most refined current artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to respond optimally to a completely unanticipated environment. And if you want to take advantage of that new environment, you need people with their processing power or their brains to explore the unanticipated.
Марк, спасибо большое. Я тоже очень большой сторонник пилотируемой космонавтики.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. And I'm also a staunch supporter of people in space.
Буквально небольшая история. Российские специалисты эту историю знают, иностранные вряд ли. Более
I have a brief story to tell. I believe my Russian colleagues in the room are familiar with that, but a team, a space crew, and not a lot of people know about that. We called it a pack of wolves.
волчья стая — это потому, что командир этой команды имел фамилию Волк, Игорь Волк.
Why we called it a pack of wolves? Because the name of the crew captain was Volk, which means wolf in Russian.
Эта команда была из лучших летчиков-испытателей. Игорь Волк совершил полет в космос, и после посадки, это было более 30 лет тому назад, после посадки он сел в самолет и прилетел на этом самолете, будучи командиром этого самолета, и в Подмосковье, в Шереметьево его посадил. В Жуковского он его посадил.
And the crew consisted of the best test pilots. And the whole story happened over 30 years ago when Igor Volk flew into space. And upon his return, he got into a plane and he flew to Zhukovka, and in Zhukovka he landed.
Это лишний раз доказывает колоссальные возможности человека-профессионала. И у нас, допустим, с Еленой, с Марком нет никакого сомнения, что ребята, которые будут прилетать на дальнюю планету, они будут очень хорошо действовать на этой планете.
This just goes to show how much a specialist, an expert can do and what his capabilities are. And I think both Yelena and Mark will support me in saying that human beings can do a lot and they can achieve a lot on those remote planets when they arrive there.
Дорогие коллеги, вот рядом с нами сидит Стивен, представляет Антверпский университет бельгийский. Очень широкое сотрудничество с нашим институтом. В частности, Елена Томиловская вместе с Стивеном вместе работает. Какой-нибудь каверзный вопрос Стивену задайте, пожалуйста, Леночка.
We see a young colleague here from University of Antwerp. I understand that Antwerp cooperates very well with our institute. And I would like Yelena to ask Stephen a very tricky question.
You ready?
I think
Okay. We have really impressive results with MRI immediately after flight and 6 months after flight. And we see that not all the changes comes back and disappear. Can you imagine what we will see 6 months past? I mean, 1 year after flight. Will the changes disappear? What do you think?
What do I think? That's a very good question. Well, in the theoretical framework that we think our results are placed in right now, it does seem that there is this kind of very gradual normalization course. So when maybe in a couple of years, like 2 or 3 years, everything could be back to normal. The exact time point is still the big question, I think. But maybe other changes from immediately after spaceflight can actually sustain for a long time. But maybe this is not particularly bad, and maybe this is a sort of adaptation that for maybe next time they go to space, then they already have this intermediate phase of the change, so that they don't have the big first change of after space flights. And I think when we look at the few data that we have from the first time cosmonauts, the ones who fly for the first time, the effects are usually a bit bigger than the ones that have been into space already. So I think it depends on the different types of changes that occur in the brain, whether they actually normalize or if they persist, and if it's good or bad, then we still need to link this to other behavioral measures and stuff like that.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вот, Стивен, вам вопрос и Елене. Вы же проводили исследования после орбитальных космических полетов, ну, максимально 300, сколько, 40 дней были, ребята? Не год, 340 дней.
I have a question both to you and to Yelena. Your research covered mostly the orbital flights of 340 days, a bit under a year, right?
Yes, but
А что мы будем делать, когда человек полетит на Марс, там поработает, и дай бог ему прилетит назад? Он прилетит здоровый?
What do you think will happen if human beings fly to Mars and then they work there and come back, hopefully? In what state will they come back? Will they return healthy?
I think
Марк, присоединяйся.
Yeah, we have no idea. We have very little information on the hypogravity situation. That is, if you can, assuming that you make it to Mars or the Moon healthily, does the gravity level on on either of those places provide a significant enough countermeasure to stop some of the deficits and enable a safe return to the Earth? But it begs another question, which is the equation, the calculation is completely different if you're willing to go and not come back, in which case the adaptive processes that take place for either zero G or a lower G level don't have to be reversed when you come back to the Earth. And so it's very likely that you will cross a line, maybe after you've lived on the Moon for 2 years, maybe 1 year, in which you really don't want to come back to Earth, that it's physiologically too challenging.
Марк, спасибо большое. Мы немножко узурпировали наши вопросы. Пожалуйста, может быть, в зале кто-то хочет спросить, пожалуйста.
Thank you so much. I understand that we've been a bit carried away here on the stage, and there are still some questions from the audience. So please.
Thank you so much for your presentations. This is a question from Kirill Pletner, our editor-in-chief of the Aerospace Journal. He's wondering, since 80% of the Asgardian population is male, they're very interested to know whether, and young males, actually, we're getting some more specific information here. Have there been any studies on whether space flights, how they affect the erection? And if they do, if there have been any studies, what are the countermeasures known so far? Thank you.
Вопрос понятный.
The question is quite clear, thanks.
Кто желает ответить на этот вопрос? Давайте Стивену, может быть, попросим ответить.
So who would like to answer? It could be Stephen.
I have no clue at all.
Стивен, joke, of course, excuse me. Mark.
I have no clue either, but you know, if there are any, I wouldn't call them studies. If there's any information, I would say it would be anecdotal. And as they say, those who know aren't talking, those who are talking don't know. So formally and officially, I don't know that there's any information.
Это мнение нашего американского коллеги. Теперь российская сторона два слова скажет. Поэтому вот Лена испугалась, говорит, я ничего не знаю.
Well, our American colleague doesn't know about that, so I was wondering about our Russian colleague. Does she know? And she was a bit taken aback.
I've just heard that we had some studies with rats. I'm not about human on biosatellites. I know we had some studies.
По поводу животных мы тоже все знаем, что мы делаем. Но у меня есть некоторая информация все-таки по человеческому фактору.
Well, we have some information about animals, about tests on animals, but also have some information regarding human beings.
Вы знаете, это необычайная интимная область исследований, и вне всякого сомнения она очень и очень большой интерес представляет.
This is the area of research which is directly related with intimacy and is of great importance to scientists.
Дело в том, что каждый космонавт, подписывая программу полета, он имеет право вычеркнуть те эксперименты, в которых он не хочет принимать участие.
Each cosmonaut signing on the dotted line has the right to cross out those experiments he does not wish to perform.
К сожалению, подавляющее большинство космонавтов эти исследования вычеркивают.
And unfortunately, the vast majority of cosmonauts do cross out that kind of research, that kind of experiments.
Но в неофициальных контактах очень много хорошего рассказывают, очень много интересного. И пример того, что все-таки на многие годы остается все-таки более-менее нормальная эта сфера. У огромного количества космонавтов рождаются после этого дети здоровые. Но это не факт, что не надо обследовать. Обследовать нужно обязательно.
But people do talk off the record, and we know that most cosmonauts do not experience any problems in that area, and they do have children afterwards, and those are healthy children. But we're not saying that we should not investigate any further, and people should be checked up.
Уважаемые коллеги, меня предупреждают, что надо заканчивать. Мне очень хотелось бы дать крайний вопрос кому-то из наших иностранных коллег. Сергей, извини, я хочу все. Такой русский, как будто русские монополизировали, сами себе вопросы задают. Поэтому давайте кому-нибудь из наших коллег-иностранцев, кто хочет, может быть, сказать.
Well, I've got my sign that we have to wrap up, and I would like to give a chance for the last question. And I do believe this last question should go to a foreign colleague because it seems like a Russian party over here.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for your talks. So from London here, so definitely foreign, as you would say. I've got a question for Stephen, if you don't mind. Interesting presentation and findings. I just wanted to ask if in your theories or your studies you've been able to quantify what causes the changes that you've identified clearly on the MRI imaging. Is it more to do with kind of increased blood flow to the cranial blood flow? Is it more that you've got loss of drainage, venous drainage, from blockages to the increased CSF congestion? And also, considering the brain as a rigid box and the Monroe-Kelly kind of doctoring, would you find that CSF then flows? Do you think that might be one of the causes of having ophthalmic changes? And do you think that CSF pressure will kind of transmit or transfer into the intraocular pressure, therefore causes some of the changes that's been reported in the literature?
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for your question. So the first part was about the cause, I think, mainly about these fluid shift effects, right? So probably there are multiple causative factors playing a role here, but one thing we think plays an important role is indeed the upward fluid shift causing an increase of the central venous pressure, because the venous system in the intracranial part does not have valves, as is the case for in say the legs. So these valves are used to that the blood does not fall back towards the ground, but goes to your heart. But so above your heart, this is not needed, and because of this increase in the blood volume, you actually get an accumulation there, increasing the central venous pressure. And the central venous pressure is actually one of the driving forces for the CSF resorption, because it relies on the pressure difference between the CSF compartment and a venous compartment. So this could be one explanation. The other thing is, so there has been noted a couple in a couple of papers, an actually upward shift of the brain itself, which has also been seen in head-down bed rest studies. And another explanation could then be is that the sagittal sinus, which is the major drainage site of CSF, is actually kind of blocked or a bit compressed. And so these are already two proposed mechanisms that would cause it. Other than that, so about the ocular problems, so we don't exactly think it's, I mean, the skull in itself should be a rigid box indeed, but I think there is some kind of, how to say, a bit of interplay within the brain tissue itself, so that ventricles could expand to actually cope with this extra fluid that it has to take up. And indeed, when you have this accumulation, I think it actually resides or goes towards the places that where it actually fits, such as in the ventricles, but also, like say, the inferior part of the brain, where we saw that the CSF increased. And this could also go to the orbital side. And other proposed mechanisms are that because of the anatomical structure behind the eyeball, which is kind of a bit, they call it a cul-de-sac kind of structure, this could maybe actually cause it to cause difficulties to drain away from there, and this might also be a reason why the pressure is actually more localized, or the increased pressure is more localized behind the eye rather than in the whole brain. So, but yeah, lately there are a couple of like hypothesis papers being published about this stuff. So it's not very established yet, but there seems to be getting several links together to try to explain it. So,
thank you very much, Stephen. Dear friends, time is money, excuse me. But we open for contact. Welcome all our speakers for you, no problem. Thank you very much.